This is my published title, and this is probably a better title, given that there's so much going on at this conference, and there are so many things having to do with AI and human interaction and ethics. I'm going to be talking the second part of my talk on the kind of information we can get from the psychology of language use and apply to human-computer interaction with AI systems. And last time around, I focused on the fact that large vision language models lack pragmatic competence. We talked a little bit about Gricean pragmatics and things like that, and I told you about a couple of studies that we have done taking data from my lab and trying it out with LVLMs, large vision language models. And so today we're going to focus more on interaction, which is really an important component of language use that's completely left out of the training data that LVLMs are trained on, because they're trained on lots and lots and lots of dead old, kind of the products of human language use, which can be text corpora and things like that, and books, etc. And of course, you can get information from the statistical superficial relationships among words that could help intelligence develop about human language use, but you don't have the kind of information that people get from being in the world, interacting with the world, grounding with the meanings of objects, and grounding with other people. And so we're going to talk a lot about the interaction part today. And so I see language use as joint action. This is a theoretical position that I picked up in grad school working with Herb Clark, who has a book about this and lots of articles about it, and we published about it as well. And so today's quick outline, I'm going to quickly go through some formalisms we've developed over time a while ago on how to represent the contributions to conversation that can come from two interacting agents, where neither agent is omniscient and neither agent knows what's going on in the mind of the other agents. And the two agents basically are faced with the evidence that is presented during conversation that they can use to make inferences about whether their conversational turns are understood and taken up by the partner, okay? We'll talk a bit about how visual evidence impacts grounding, and basically I'm an experimental cognitive scientist, psychologist. I also have one foot in linguistics and another foot in computer science, which I guess makes me three-footed. But anyway, I think a lot of you are kind of in between disciplines, or you embody several disciplines, and that is me as well. But I tend to really like experimental data or tests of various ideas, acknowledging along the way that experiments are imperfect and you're making decisions in terms of what to measure. I was just at the measurement session downstairs, which I found very interesting. But I'll present you with some experimental evidence about interaction and grounding, the impacts that has on human language use, and then what happens when you bring LVLMs into the picture. So we'll talk about how people accrue common ground in conversation with other people, which is something that LVLMs do not do, okay? And we'll talk about some of the ways you can measure that. I call these conceptual packs and entrainment, and I'll define those as we go on. I'll even give you evidence from my lab about what happens when you break a conceptual pact. It turns out to matter. Basically, we can then talk about how can we get LVLMs to do all this, and even should we have LVLMs do all this? That's more of an ethical question that maybe you'll become engaged with as we go along. Okay. So some of you are aware of this long sociolinguistic tradition of conversation analysis, right? This is ethnography studies of language use, where they'll take a snippet of conversation and go over it in agonizing detail, analyzing every little pause, every little drawing out of a syllable, analyzing what the interaction is between the people, the interlocutors involved, where they're looking, what they're gesturing. And so one of the contributions in terms of a unit in conversation was this idea of an adjacency pair that came from Manny Shegloffs and Sachs back in 1973. And so they have this notion that you have an adjacency pair, which means a turn from one person associated with a turn from the other person. And so they went through this taxonomy of things that are common in conversation, like questions and answers, okay? And, we have this sort of command dialogue structure in human-computer interaction where you type something in, you get some kind of response. Sometimes the system can take the initiative and prompt you with a request for information, let's say if you're filling out a form, and then you provide the answer. So this old way of looking at conversation groups it into pairs of terms that actually accomplish something in the world. This could be a form of joint action, right? But the problem is that, so this example, I don't know if you can see it in the back. Someone says, where is the bus stop? B says, around the corner. A says, thanks. B says, you're welcome. So this would be on this analysis, two different adjacency pairs. And the problem is that, let's imagine that a bus goes by or there's an explosion as B is saying around the corner, and A may never hear what B said. And so even though B answered the question, A does not hear the answer to the question. So you can never really be sure that your utterance is taken up in the way that you expect by the partner you're interacting with. And so you need to constantly, in conversation, be considering the evidence, okay? And the way you consider the evidence may be very strict and important. Let's imagine you're an air traffic controller and you have legally instituted requirements in the language you have to use talking to a pilot, where you have to confirm certain things in a certain way, maybe by echoing part of what the other person said. This is strong evidence that you've been understood in a conversation. If you're standing in line at the checkout counter, just chatting with a stranger standing behind you, you don't really need to confirm that you understand everything. You may not care that much, you're just being friendly, and so you don't have a very high standard for evidence. But this evidence process is really kind of built into human social interaction, and the way we interpret the evidence is never deterministic or perfect. We're using our best guess at what could be going on in the mind of the other person based on what they do or say or where they look or whatever. And so this evidence process, I think, is really important to think about. So with adjacency pairs, you know, the whole theory in sociolinguistics behind this, and again, this is based on ethnographic analysis, not experimentation or anything that formal. Sachs, Shedloff, and Gail Jefferson in 1974 proposed this very famous theory of turn-taking by which the interlocutors in a conversation manage the so-called conversational floor by a series of rules. And the conversational floor was seen as a limited resource that people were competing for. So I've never liked, although I love ethnographic analyses, and I think it's important to engage with the data directly, I've never loved this analysis because I don't think this is what conversation is about at all, okay? I think conversation is something much more collaborative. You're not competing for the floor. If you have a shared purpose with someone, you're both working to achieve that shared purpose, and you're not trying to own the floor as long as the conversational purpose gets advanced. So yesterday I talked about grounding, and this is when you're talking about conversation, this is the exchange of evidence where two people are trying to establish that they're on the same page and reach a mutual belief, okay? And so in this case, I mentioned B doesn't know he successfully answered A in turn number 2 until he has evidence that she's taken up his answer in turn number 3. So this formalism doesn't capture that at all. So if you have a different formalism, this is something that Herb Clark came up with mathematician Ed Schaefer decades ago. They saw these sorts of turns in a conversation as contributions. Okay, so every contribution to a conversation has two phases. One is the presentation of the turn. It might be an utterance. It might even be an action. You know, if you ask me for something and I hand it to you, that's my presentation of my turn. Okay, and so for every presentation, you have to have an acceptance phase. So you can see this sort of graph structure. Instead of isolated adjacency pairs, we have an exchange, which is a contribution with a presentation and an acceptance, and another presentation and acceptance. So basically then the first set of adjacency pair, the first adjacency pair gets structurally related to the second one, because what the two partners are doing is they're modeling each other in their mind's eye, basically in terms of what they've achieved so far in the conversation, okay? And so we have these presentations and acceptances. And so, you know, take a simple example. You know, a lot of my computer science colleagues basically assume that as long as you've got words that are common and everyone understands the words, and you're using them typically, and both partners are similar, you're going to succeed, right? So words are like little packages of meaning. But it turns out that's not true. So this is an example from years ago. I walked into my grad school office and said to my grad school office mate, who was, by the way, a person of the same age, same gender, working with the same advisor in the same lab, speaking the same language, spending lots of time in the same office, working on similar topics for our dissertation research. I said to Bridget, you don't have any nails, do you? Okay, so I was walking in carrying a giant framed poster, okay, and I was supposed to be doing my dissertation, but I was procrastinating. So I said that to Bridget, and basically, if you just have an adjacency pair, you would expect Bridget to just say no, because I was looking for nails to go put the poster up to redecorate the office to procrastinate, okay? So by an adjacency pair, that's what you would expect, a question followed by an answer, and the word nails isn't all that hard to process, presumably, right? And so what actually happened was there's a long pause, and Bridget said, fingernails? And I said, no, nails to nail into the wall. And then there was another long pause, and probably Bridget was wondering, is she being sarcastic? She's often sarcastic, but I then had to present a justification because I realized our conversation purpose was not shared at all. So I said, when I get bored here, I'm going to go put up these pictures, and then Bridget was able to answer them. So we have this really complex dance of providing evidence and seeking evidence. So one partner, whoever realizes that there's something wrong with the conversation, will take the responsibility to either provide the evidence or seek the evidence, okay? So I think that's an important thing you want to capture in any kind of formalism of interaction. And so what Clark and Schaefer did was they presented this sort of repair structure. And so they have an example here from the London Lund corpus, where they're talking about real estate. So A says to B, who evaluates the property? And B says, whoever you ask, the surveyor for the building society. And A says, no, I'm not, who decides what price it will go on the market? And B snorts and says, whatever people will pay. Maybe, there's no one who decides that. Your presumption is wrong in answering that question. And so the problem with this view of Clark and Schaefer is that they're representing 2 points of view merged into one single representation. So clearly, from A and B's perspective, there was no such omniscient representation, okay? And so what we did to extend this was Janet Kahn and I, who's an NLP researcher, basically, you can imagine A is modeling the conversation so far. So after B said, after response number 2, B says, whoever you ask, B realizes that her question has not been answered. And so she's starting to construct kind of a mental structure where we're not done yet. I have to go back and try again, okay? Whereas over here, B's hypothesis is, well, I just presented an answer. We should be done. Let's move on. So B does not yet know that a repair is necessary. So what this example points out is that when you're in an actual spontaneous unfolding in the moment conversation, the two agents have different models of what's going on. And one person almost always realizes that there's a problem before the other one does. And basically, you could just respond with a pause, in which case the other one might realize there's a problem and take the initiative to debug it, or you might actually respond with a no, I meant type of thing, which is what happens in this example. So in this case, A took responsibility for initiating the repair. So I think this is a much better view of what's going on when people manage the so-called conversational floor. What they're really doing is they're seeking and providing evidence that they're on the same page with whatever topic it is they're discussing. So I find this to be a useful formalism, but it comes from 27 years ago when Janet and I presented this at a workshop for AAAI in Massachusetts, quite a while ago. But I think it's useful. And so I see conversation as a complementary process of hypothesis testing. And so what I say to you is my best guess, my hypothesis of what I think you may understand. And if I see everyone get up and leave the room, I might change what I'm saying or fall asleep. I might attribute that to maybe I'm not entertaining enough, or if you just start shaking your head or shouting at me, I might interpret that as disagreement. And then you're at the same time testing your hypothesis of what you think I mean. You've heard the beginning of my utterance, you haven't heard how I've completed it yet. So there's this active mental cognitive process of trying to disambiguate what it is I'm saying, and you're also trying to predict how I'm going to end what I'm saying. And so it's a very kind of generative predictive process that you as an advocacy are going through at the same time that I'm speaking, okay? So my argument in general from this grounding theory that Clark and colleagues are responsible for, basically turn-taking in conversation, because we have to linearize our utterances to some extent. We also can talk at the same time. People do that much more than some conversational analysts would admit. I mean, there is a pressure to not overlapping, but culturally sometimes people do talk in unison, and that's seen as a thing. And so we're not really trying to manage a conversational flow when we interact. What we're doing is we're trying to seek and provide evidence that we have reached mutual understanding of something. Okay. So, with that in mind, I'll show you an experiment that I did to basically look at this sort of initiative and how it unfolds in a task where two people are in separate cubicles and they each have the same map on a screen, and one of the people is the director and the other one is the matcher, and the goal is for the director to convey in language talking to the matcher where a particular icon on the map is, so that the matcher can take their little car icon and put it in the same location on the map, okay? And so they can't see each other, they can talk only. And so the idea is that they have to get their icons aligned. Now I picked this task because as an experimenter, we also can't see into the brains of our subjects, so we look for some kind of experiment with a task that can allow us to see when people really do understand each other and when they don't. Okay? And so there are two conditions in this. Well, there are more than two, but the two I'll talk about are the condition where the director can actually see the progress of the matcher's car as the matcher moves their car to the location the director is describing. And the other half of the time, the director cannot see the matcher's car. And the two of them were well aware of what condition they were in. So we inform them of that every block of the experiment when the conditions switch. And so here's an example from this. This is when the director can see what the matcher is doing. Let's see if this works. Whoops, I will probably play it again.
Shoot to find.
Let's start over. Okay, here we go.
Okay, now we're going northeast. Wait, stop. Okay, that body of water, there's a snoot. What does that say? Shoot, flying, Hill Road. Okay, you want to park right on the fly, right there.
So think of the timing here. This is pretty amazing. I've adopted the same kind of transcription conventions that the sociolinguists use when they transcribe human conversation. So you can see that these are all little installments. And they're very collaborative, very efficient. No one's competing for the floor. And basically, the director's utterance is timed actually with the movements of the icon, the matcher's icon. And so I have all those data. We can look at those. And it's also very collaborative. So there's a confirmation question embedded in these installments. What does that say? Shoot, flying, yep, Hill Road. So they established together what the name of the referent is. And you can see by this little red note that I put here, that's right there is where the matcher decided that she understood what the director was saying. So we have a little window into the minds of both the director and the matcher here. And so basically what we did was we graphed this as, because we have a map and we have the two icons and they're getting closer and closer, the director's is stationary, the matcher's is moving. So we get to see whenever the matcher is close enough that they would be considered correct, which was about 10 pixels or 20 pixels from the final location. And you can see that it's very, very efficient and rapid when the director can see where the matcher is looking, so they can basically say right there, they can use a deictic expression to tell the matcher that you're there. So the matcher doesn't have to think too much and evaluate whether they're correct or not. So that responsibility is given over to the director, okay? So if you think about this in terms of presentations and acceptances, the Clark and Schaefer formalism that we modified for this purpose, the presentations and acceptances, this is kind of pretty much approximates the presentation phase over here, and the acceptance phase is very, very rapid because the director can take responsibility for it, okay? Here's an example for when the director cannot see the matcher.
In the far upper right-hand corner of the screen, it says C Street. Yeah. Way up top. Yeah. You're just a little bit on the road, and the corner of your car is touching A on C, but you're mostly off the road. The road is to your right, just touching the car. The road is to the right of the car? Put the car right on the road, and you'll overlap me. Okay.
So the rate of convergence between the matcher's car icon and the director's target is really, really slow compared to the previous one, right? And so I've highlighted in red, which corresponds to the arrow in terms of seconds, right when they could have stopped and they would have been correct, but they had not yet reached mutual knowledge. They had not reached a mutually acceptable set of contributions to the conversation. You can think of this as common ground with a belief that they have done the task properly. So when you only have visual evidence, then things are quite different from when you have that kind of evidence. So what's really interesting is that the matcher, even though what the matcher experiences in that cubicle with that screen talking to the director, nothing changes from the matcher's perspective. But when the matcher knows the director can see what they're doing, they stop uttering verbal back channels, and they just use their movement of the car as their turn in the conversation. So this is a very implicit, automated process that people are really used to doing in conversation. Okay, so